The jackhammer's rhythmic pounding had been background noise for weeks in Newington, Connecticut, just another construction project in a town that had seen dozens of them. June 2024 was unseasonably hot, the kind of thick, humid heat that made the air feel solid, and the crew breaking ground for the new Riverside shopping plaza was counting down the hours until quitting time. It was a Tuesday afternoon, just past 3 o'clock, when the backhoe operator named Miguel Torres hit something that made his machine shudder and stop. He'd been digging for 6 hours, carving through layers of Connecticut soil and clay, clearing the lot where a Starbucks and a nail salon would eventually stand. But this wasn't rock. This wasn't a pipe or old foundation. Miguel climbed down from his machine, walked to the edge of the excavation, and stared down at what looked like rotted canvas, dark and stained, wrapped around something that his mind didn't want to identify. He called his foreman over. The foreman called the site supervisor. The site supervisor took one look and called 911. Within 30 minutes, the construction site transformed into something else entirely. Police cruisers blocked both entrances to the lot. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off the excavation area. Detective Sarah Chen from the Newington Police Department stood at the edge of the hole, hands on her hips, studying what the backhoe had uncovered. She'd been a detective for 8 years, long enough to recognize human remains when she saw them, even when they'd been in the ground for what appeared to be a very long time. The Connecticut State Police Major Crime Squad arrived with their forensic anthropologist, a thin woman named Dr. Torter. Rebecca Walsh, who climbed down into the excavation with the careful movements of someone who understood that what she was looking at was once a person with a name and a family and a life that had been stolen. Dr. Torger Du. Walsh worked for 2 hours while detectives and construction workers watched in silence, the only sounds the distant traffic on the Berlin Turnpike and the occasional radio crackle from police cars. When she finally climbed out of the hole, her face was grim. Human remains. Female. Young, maybe teenage, based on bone development. Been here a long time. Decades, not years. The canvas wrapping was deteriorated, but intact enough to tell a story. Someone had wrapped this body carefully, deliberately, trying to conceal it. The location told another story. This lot had been undeveloped woodland in the 1980s, dense with trees and undergrowth, the kind of place where you could dig without being seen. It had stayed that way until a developer bought it in 2022, and even then, it had taken 2 years for permits and planning before the first machine broke ground. Whoever buried this girl had chosen well. She might have stayed hidden forever if Newington hadn't needed another shopping plaza. If Miguel Torres hadn't been operating that particular backhoe on that particular Tuesday, if the bucket hadn't hit that exact spot. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light. Detective Chen made the call to check missing persons records going back 40 years. Connecticut kept meticulous records, and within 3 hours, they had a list of 17 young women who'd vanished from the greater Hartford area between 1975 and 1990 and were never found. 17 families who'd spent decades wondering. 17 cases that had grown cold and been filed away. But dental records are remarkably durable, and teeth survive long after soft tissue disappears. The forensic odontologist worked through the night, comparing x-rays from the remains to the dental charts of missing girls. By Wednesday morning, they had a match that made Detective Chen's stomach turn. The bones belonged to Jennifer Hayes, 16 years old, missing since November 9, 1984, 40 years ago this coming fall. Jennifer Hayes had been the kind of girl everyone noticed, but in the best possible ways. Not because she was trying to be noticed, but because there was something luminous about her, something genuine that drew people in. She'd been a junior at Newington High School in the fall of 1984, a gymnast with a specialty in floor exercise, the kind of athlete who made difficult moves look effortless. Her coach, Mrs. Towers. Patricia Donnelly would later tell police that Jennifer had real potential, that college scouts were already watching her, that she had a legitimate shot at a scholarship to UConn or maybe even somewhere bigger. But it wasn't just gymnastics that defined her. Jennifer had been in the honors program, pulling straight A's in classes she actually cared about, getting B's in the ones she didn't because she was honest enough to know she'd never use trigonometry again and didn't see the point in stressing over it. She played flute in the school band. She volunteered at the church food pantry every other Saturday. She had a laugh that carried, loud and unself-conscious, the kind of laugh that made other people smile even if they didn't know what was funny. Her family lived on Pondview Drive in a modest split-level ranch with blue shutters and a basketball hoop in the driveway. Robert Hayes worked as a supervisor at a factory that made industrial bearings, the kind of steady blue-collar job that paid the mortgage and put food on the table and maybe allowed for a vacation to Cape Cod every other summer. Patricia Hayes was a school nurse at the middle school, the person kids went to when they needed a Band-Aid or wanted to avoid gym class or just needed an adult who'd listen without judgment. Jennifer's younger brother Michael was 13 in 1984, and that awkward stage where he alternated between worshiping his older sister and being mortified by everything she did. They fought over the phone, over the bathroom, over who got the last piece of pizza, normal sibling warfare. The kind of thing that seems trivial until suddenly one of you is gone and you'd give anything to fight about the phone one more time. Jennifer had been dating Derek Manning since sophomore year, and it was the kind of high school romance that made other kids jealous. Derek was the starting quarterback, good-looking in that all-American way with sandy hair and an easy smile, but he wasn't a jerk about it. He opened doors for Jennifer. He carried her books between classes even though his teammates gave him grief for it. He showed up to every one of her gymnastics meets and sat in the bleachers cheering louder than anyone else. They'd already started talking about the future in that half-serious, half-fantasy way that teenagers do. Maybe they'd both go to UConn. Maybe they'd get an apartment together after graduation. Maybe they'd get married someday, though that felt impossibly far away when you're 16 and 17 and the whole world is supposed to be ahead of you. Friday, November 9th, 1984, started like any other day in the Hayes household. Jennifer woke up to her alarm clock radio playing Wham! "Wake Me Up Before You Go Go," a song she claimed to hate, but Patricia noticed she was always humming. She got ready for school with her usual tornado of activity, running late because she'd hit snooze twice, grabbing a Pop-Tart and kissing her mother on the cheek as she rushed out the door. Patricia called after her to drive carefully. Jennifer waved without turning around, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her dark hair pulled into a ponytail. That image, Patricia would later say, was burned into her memory with a clarity that was both a gift and a curse. The last time she saw her daughter alive, and she'd been too rushed to really look at her, to memorize her face, to know that she should hold on to that moment because there wouldn't be another one. School was school. Jennifer aced a quiz in English, struggled through a chemistry lab, ate lunch with her usual group of friends in the cafeteria. She had gymnastics practice after school, 2 hours of conditioning and routine work, and Coach Donnelly remembered her being in good spirits, nailing a new combination on the floor that she'd been working on for weeks. Practice ended at 6. Jennifer showered in the locker room, changed back into her jeans and Newington High sweatshirt, said goodbye to her teammates. She had to work that evening, a shift at Friendly's Ice Cream on the Berlin Turnpike, the part-time job she'd taken to save money for a car of her own. She was tired of borrowing her mom's station wagon, tired of having to coordinate schedules, ready for the independence that came with her own set of keys. Friendly's on a Friday night in 1984 was exactly what you'd imagine. Families with small kids getting ice cream after dinner. Teenagers on dates sharing sundaes. The jukebox in the corner playing a mix of current hits and oldies. Jennifer worked the counter, scooping ice cream and making milkshakes, her name tag slightly crooked because the pin in the back was loose. Her shift was supposed to end at 9, but they'd been busy and she stayed until 9:45 to help close up. Her manager, a college student named Tom Richards, would later tell police that Jennifer had been in a good mood that night, talking about her plans for the weekend, mentioning that Derek was taking her to see The Terminator on Saturday. She clocked out at 9:43. She grabbed her jacket from the break room. She said goodnight to Tom and the other closing employee. She walked out the back door into the employee parking lot where her mother's beige Ford station wagon was parked under a streetlight. And then she vanished. Patricia Hayes wasn't worried at first when Jennifer didn't come home by 10:30. The girl was 16, responsible, but maybe she'd stopped at Derek's house, maybe she'd gone out with coworkers for a late snack. But by 11, when there was no call and no Jennifer, worry started gnawing at the edges of Patricia's mind. She called Derek's house. His mother said he'd been home all evening, hadn't seen Jennifer since school. She called Friendly's. Tom said Jennifer had left almost an hour and a half ago. By 11:30, Patricia was calling the police, her voice shaking as she explained that her daughter was missing, that this wasn't like her, that something was wrong. Robert drove to Friendly's, found the station wagon still sitting in the parking lot, keys on the ground beside the driver's side door as if they'd been dropped. The driver's door was closed but unlocked. Jennifer's purse was on the passenger seat, her wallet inside with her license and the $43 in tips she'd made that night. Her jacket was gone. The Newington police responded quickly because Patricia Hayes was one of their own, a school nurse they all knew and respected. By midnight, there were 3 patrol cars at Friendly's, officers combing the parking lot with flashlights, interviewing Tom Richards and anyone else who'd been working that night. By dawn on Saturday, the search had expanded. Volunteers from the high school, from the church, from the neighborhood fanned out across Newington looking for any sign of Jennifer Hayes. Her face was on the local news by Saturday afternoon. That school photo where she was smiling and her hair was perfectly curled and she looked so young and so alive. Patricia stood in front of news cameras with Robert's arm around her shoulders, pleading for anyone who'd seen anything to come forward, pleading for Jennifer to come home if she could hear this, promising her she wasn't in trouble, that they just wanted her safe. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The station wagon was processed for evidence, but there was nothing useful, just Jennifer's fingerprints and her family's and smudged prints from the door handle that could have belonged to anyone. Police interviewed everyone who knew Jennifer. They interviewed Derek so many times he started to feel like a suspect, even though 30 people confirmed he'd been at a team party until midnight that Friday. They interviewed classmates, teachers, neighbors, customers who'd been at Friendly's that night. They found a witness who remembered seeing a dark van parked at the edge of a lot around the time Jennifer would have been leaving, but the description was vague and the van was never found. They questioned the drifter who'd been spotted in the area that week, a man with a history of petty crimes who made the cops' instincts flare, but his alibi was solid, and there was no evidence connecting him to Jennifer. The case went cold, not because the police stopped caring, but because there was nowhere left to look. By 1986, Detective John Kowalski, the lead investigator, had exhausted every lead, chased every rumor, followed every tip that came in from psychics and concerned citizens and people who swore they'd seen Jennifer in Florida or California or Canada. He kept a file on his desk for the rest of his career, would pull it out every few months, and read through it again looking for something he'd missed. When he retired in 2002, he asked if he could keep copies of the case files at home. His captain said yes. Kowalski died in 2019, but his daughter found the Jennifer Hayes files in his home office, still organized, still annotated with his handwriting, still marked with the weight of unsolved guilt that good detectives carry. Patricia and Robert Hayes never stopped hoping, even when hope became a form of torture. They kept Jennifer's room exactly as she'd left it. The gymnastics trophies on the shelf, the Duran Duran poster on the wall, the bed made with the rainbow comforter Jennifer had picked out when she was 14. Patricia would sometimes sit in that room in the dark talking to the absence her daughter had left behind, telling her about Michael's graduation, about his wedding, about the grandchildren she'd never meet. Robert aged a decade in the first year after Jennifer disappeared, his hair going gray, his shoulders stooping under a weight no parent should carry. He died in April 2019, his heart giving out at 76, and Patricia knew it wasn't just age that killed him. It was 40 years of not knowing. Michael Hayes was 54 in June 2024, living in Manchester with his wife and 2 teenage daughters, working as an engineer for an aerospace company. He'd spent 40 years as the brother of the missing girl, that identity following him through high school and college and into adulthood. People who knew his story looked at him differently, with a mixture of pity and uncomfortable curiosity. He learned to live with his sister's absence the way you learn to live with a chronic injury, always there, always aching, sometimes bearable and sometimes not. When Detective Sarah Chen called him on that Wednesday morning to tell him they'd found Jennifer, Michael was at work reviewing technical drawings. He heard the words but couldn't process them. Found her. After 40 years, found her. He asked where. Detective Chen told him about the construction site, about the remains, about the dental records. Michael thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat at his desk staring at nothing while his coworkers asked if he was okay. He wasn't okay. He'd never been okay since November 1984. But at least now there was an answer to the question that had haunted his family for 4 decades. At least now they knew Jennifer hadn't run away, hadn't started a new life somewhere else, hadn't abandoned them by choice. She'd been taken. She'd been murdered. And she'd been buried 3 miles from their house, hidden in the woods while they'd searched and prayed and hoped. Detective Chen drove to Hartford to tell Patricia Hayes in person. The old woman was 76 now, living in a small apartment in a senior community, her body diminished by age and grief, but her mind still sharp. When she opened the door and saw Detective Chen's face, she knew before any words were spoken. Mothers always know. She listened to the explanation about the construction site, about the forensic analysis, about the identification. She didn't cry. She'd used up all her tears decades ago. Instead, she nodded slowly and said, "Can I bury her now? Can I finally bring my baby home?" Detective Chen said yes. And then Patricia asked the question that would drive everything that came next. "Do you know who did this? After all these years, can you find out who took her from us?" Detective Chen looked at the old woman and thought about the advances in forensic science, about DNA analysis that didn't exist in 1984, about genetic genealogy that had started solving cold cases everyone thought were unsolvable. She thought about the tissue samples already on their way to the state lab, about the possibility that Jennifer's killer had left evidence on her body or her clothing that 40 years in the ground might have actually preserved. She met Patricia Hayes' eyes and said something that surprised them both. "Yes, I think we can." The investigation in November 1984 had all the urgency of a community in crisis. Within hours of Jennifer Hayes being reported missing, Newington police mobilized every available resource. Detective John Kowalski, 42 years old and a 15-year veteran, took the lead, and from the moment he saw that abandoned station wagon in the Friendly's parking lot with the keys on the ground, he knew this wasn't a runaway situation. Teenage girls who run away take their purses. They take their money. They don't leave their car unlocked with their belongings inside and their keys dropped on the pavement like they've been startled or grabbed mid-action. Kowalski had 3 daughters of his own, and the thought of any one of them disappearing like this made his chest tight with a fear he had to push down to do his job effectively. The forensic capabilities of 1984 were primitive compared to what would come later, but the Newington police did everything they could with what they had. They dusted the station wagon for fingerprints and found dozens, most belonging to Jennifer and her family, some smudged partials on the door handle that could have been anyone's. They searched the interior for signs of struggle and found nothing. They collected hair and fiber samples that filled evidence bags but couldn't tell them much without DNA analysis, which wouldn't become standard police procedure for another decade. They took plaster casts of tire tracks in the parking lot, but the asphalt was old and cracked and the impressions were too degraded to be useful. They interviewed every employee at Friendly's, every customer who'd been there that night, every business owner along that stretch of Berlin Turnpike. Someone had to have seen something. Tom Richards, the manager who'd closed with Jennifer, was 21 and studying business at Central Connecticut State University. He told Kowalski that Jennifer had been her usual self that night, friendly with customers, joking with the other employee about a teacher they both had. She'd mentioned her date with Derek the next day. She talked about being tired from gymnastics practice. Nothing suggested she was scared or worried or expecting to meet anyone. When her shift ended at 9:45, she'd clocked out, grabbed her jacket from the break room, and called out goodbye as she headed for the back door. Tom had been in the kitchen doing inventory. The other closing employee, a high school senior named Michelle Porter, had been in the storage room restocking supplies. Neither of them had walked Jennifer to her car. Neither of them had looked out the window to make sure she got there safely. That guilt would haunt them both for years. Derek Manning became the immediate focus of scrutiny because statistically, when a young woman disappears, the boyfriend is always the first suspect. Derek was 17, a senior at Newington High, and he'd been dating Jennifer for almost 2 years. Kowalski brought him in for questioning the day after Jennifer vanished, and the kid had been genuinely terrified, his hands shaking, his voice breaking when he talked about Jennifer. He'd been at a party at teammate Jake Morrison's house from 8 o'clock until well past midnight. Jake's parents had been home. There had been 28 people there, all members of the football team and their girlfriends and friends. Kowalski interviewed every single one of them. Every single one confirmed Derek had been there all night, that he'd never left, that he'd been playing pool in the basement and eating pizza and doing all the normal things teenage boys do at parties. His alibi was ironclad. But Kowalski pushed anyway because good detectives don't trust alibis until they've been tested from every angle. He looked into Derek's background, talked to his teachers, his coaches, his parents, his neighbors. Everyone painted the same picture of a decent kid. Athletic and popular but not arrogant about it, genuinely devoted to Jennifer. Kowalski pulled Derek's phone records and found exactly what he'd expect to find: regular calls to Jennifer's house, to his teammates, to the pizza place where he worked weekends. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that suggested he'd been planning anything or hiding anything. 3 weeks into the investigation, Kowalski had to accept what his gut had been telling him from the start. Derek Manning hadn't hurt Jennifer Hayes. Derek Manning had loved Jennifer Hayes. And now he was another victim of whatever had happened that night. A 17-year-old kid who carried the weight of being suspected and the grief of losing his girlfriend for the rest of his life. The witness reports started coming in within days, and like always, some were helpful and some were noise, and most were impossible to verify. A woman named Sharon Kowalski, no relation to the detective, had been driving past Friendly's around 9:30 that Friday night and remembered seeing a dark-colored van parked at the far edge of the employee lot, near the dumpsters. It had stood out to her because the lot was well lit near the building, but dark in that back corner, and she thought it was an odd place to park. She couldn't describe the driver, couldn't even say for certain if anyone was inside. Just a dark van, possibly blue or black, older model, maybe a Ford or Chevy. Kowalski put out a bulletin asking anyone with information about a dark van to come forward. He got 47 calls in 3 days. None of them led anywhere useful. A transient named Raymond Walsh had been spotted in Newington that week, sleeping behind a shopping plaza, panhandling near the highway exit. Walsh was 34, with a criminal record that included petty theft, trespassing, and 1 arrest for indecent exposure. When local police picked him up for questioning, he'd been nervous and evasive, which made him look guilty of something even if they didn't know what. Kowalski interrogated him for 6 hours. Walsh admitted he'd been in the area. He admitted he'd walked past Friendly's a few times that week hoping to get free ice cream from the dumpster after closing. But on Friday night, he said, he'd been in Hartford at a shelter, had a bed there, could prove it. The shelter records confirmed his story. Walsh died in 1997 of liver failure in a VA hospital in Springfield, Massachusetts. His connection to Jennifer's case, nothing more than bad timing and a sketchy background that made him an easy suspect. The investigation consumed Kowalski's life through the end of 1984 and into 1985. He followed up on reported sightings of Jennifer in 3 different states, all of them dead ends. He consulted with FBI profilers who suggested they might be looking for an opportunistic predator, someone who'd been watching Jennifer, who knew her routine, who'd waited for the right moment. He organized search parties that combed through miles of woods and fields around Newington, looking for clothing, jewelry, any sign of Jennifer. They found nothing. The case generated hundreds of tips, and Kowalski ran down every single one, no matter how unlikely. A psychic called to say she'd seen Jennifer alive in Texas. A man in California wrote claiming he'd seen a girl matching Jennifer's description working at a diner. A teenager in Newington swore she'd seen Jennifer get into a red pickup truck willingly, as if she knew the driver, but that lead evaporated when the teenager admitted she might have been thinking of a different day and a different person. By 1986, the active investigation had stalled. Kowalski still worked the case whenever he could, but new crimes demanded attention and resources. Jennifer's face stayed on missing person bulletins. Her case was entered into the National Crime Information Center database. The Connecticut State Police kept the file open. But the daily urgency faded, replaced by the grinding frustration of a case gone cold. Kowalski kept Jennifer's photo on his desk, a constant reminder of the girl he couldn't save and the killer he couldn't catch. He'd pull the file out every few months, reread the witness statements, study the evidence logs, hoping that fresh eyes, even his own, might see something new. Nothing ever appeared. The Hayes family endured the way families do when they have no choice. Patricia threw herself into her work at the school, channeling her grief into caring for other people's children since she couldn't care for her own. Robert became quieter, more distant, the light in his eyes dimming year by year. Michael finished high school carrying the weight of being Jennifer's brother, the missing girl's little brother, forever defined by a tragedy he couldn't control or understand. The family held memorial services on every anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance, standing in the cold every November 9th to light candles and pray and beg anyone who knew anything to come forward. The crowds got smaller each year. By the 10th anniversary, it was just family and a handful of close friends and Detective Kowalski, who showed up every single year even though he'd retired in 2002. Kowalski died in January 2019 at the age of 77, his heart giving out while he was shoveling snow from his driveway. His daughter Emily found the Jennifer Hayes files in his home office a week later while sorting through his belongings. 3 thick binders meticulously organized, every document in plastic sleeves, every piece of evidence photographed and cataloged. Pages of notes in her father's handwriting, theories he'd developed and discarded, questions he'd never been able to answer. Emily called the Newington Police Department and spoke to Detective Sarah Chen, who'd taken over cold case reviews the year before. Chen drove to Emily's house that same afternoon and sat at the kitchen table reading through Kowalski's personal files, seeing the case through the eyes of a detective who'd never been able to let it go. Fast forward to June 2024. The remains found at the construction site had been identified as Jennifer Hayes within 24 hours. Detective Chen stood in the Connecticut State Police Forensic Lab watching Dr. Rebecca Walsh and her team work with a reverence that bordered on religious. 40 years in the ground should have destroyed most biological evidence, but the canvas wrapping that had seemed so macabre had actually protected Jennifer's remains from the elements. The cool, dark environment and the waterproof canvas had created conditions similar to a controlled storage facility. More importantly, bones preserved DNA far longer than soft tissue. Dr. Walsh extracted samples from the femur, the most likely to yield usable genetic material, and sent them to the lab for analysis. The DNA extraction took 3 days. Modern techniques could pull genetic profiles from degraded samples that would have been impossible to process in the 1980s or even the early 2000s. When the results came back, Chen had a full DNA profile of Jennifer Hayes, confirmed against DNA samples from Michael Hayes, her surviving brother. But that wasn't what made Chen's pulse quicken. The evidence bags from 1984 had been in storage for 40 years, preserved in a climate-controlled facility per department protocol. Among those bags were the fiber samples collected from Jennifer's jacket, the one piece of her clothing that had been found in the car. In 1984, those fibers had been examined under a microscope and determined to be foreign, not matching anything from Jennifer's home or car, but there was nothing more they could do with them. In 2024, those same fibers yielded epithelial cells, skin cells, DNA from someone who touched Jennifer's jacket, possibly grabbed it, possibly pulled it. Someone who wasn't Jennifer. The DNA profile was male. It was complete enough to be useful. And when Chen ran it through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system containing millions of profiles from convicted offenders, she got nothing, no match. Whoever this DNA belonged to had never been arrested for a serious crime, had never had their genetic profile entered into law enforcement databases. 20 years ago, that would have been the end of the road. But Chen had been reading about forensic genealogy, about the technique that had caught the Golden State Killer and dozens of other cold case suspects. She'd attended a seminar 6 months earlier where a genetic genealogist had walked investigators through the process of using public DNA databases to find suspects through their relatives. It was controversial. Privacy advocates had concerns. But it was legal, and it worked, and Jennifer Hayes deserved every tool science could provide. Chen got approval from the state's attorney's office to proceed with forensic genealogy. She contracted with Parabon Nanolabs, the same company that had worked the Clara Hoffman case and dozens of others. The DNA profile was uploaded to GED Match and Family Tree DNA, public databases where people who'd taken consumer DNA tests could upload their results to find relatives. The waiting began. Some cases got hits immediately. Some took months. Jennifer's case took 2 weeks. The match wasn't close. Maybe a third cousin or fourth cousin, someone who shared a great-great-great-grandparent with whoever had left DNA on Jennifer's jacket. But it was enough to start building a family tree. The genetic genealogist assigned to the case was named Marcus Chen, no relation to Detective Chen despite the shared last name. Marcus had a PhD in genetics and a passion for genealogy that had turned into an unexpected career solving crimes. He started with the DNA match and began the painstaking work of building family trees backward through time. Birth certificates, marriage records, death certificates, census data, immigration records, newspaper archives, church records. He built branches and sub-branches, tracking families as they moved across Connecticut and beyond over multiple generations. Some branches led nowhere useful. Some led to women who couldn't be the source of male DNA. Some led to men who died before 1984 or were too old or too young to be suspects. Chen worked with Marcus Chen, sharing information from the original investigation, providing geographical constraints and age ranges. They were looking for a male, likely in his late teens or older in 1984, who had some connection to Newington or the Friendlies area. Someone whose family tree connected to that distant DNA match. The work was meticulous and slow, like assembling a puzzle with thousands of pieces scattered across decades. By late June, Marcus had narrowed the possibilities to 2 extended family lines that had lived in Connecticut in the 1980s. By early July, he'd identified 7 men in the right age range who could theoretically have been in Newington on November 9, 1984. Detective Chen started running background checks on all 7 men. 4 of them were dead. 2 had moved out of state decades ago. 1 was still living in Connecticut, just 20 minutes from where Jennifer's body had been found. When Chen pulled his name and started reading his background, her stomach dropped. Not because he had a criminal record. He didn't. Not because he fit the profile of a violent predator. He didn't seem to. But because his name appeared in the original 1984 case file, not as a suspect, as a witness, as someone who'd helped search for Jennifer, as someone the Hayes family had trusted completely. His name was Thomas Pearson, and in 1984 he'd been Jennifer's youth group leader at St. Mary's Lutheran Church. Thomas Pearson was 58 years old in the summer of 2024, living in a modest colonial house in West Hartford with his wife of 32 years, Carol, and their golden retriever named Murphy. He worked as an insurance adjuster for a mid-sized firm in Hartford, the kind of stable, unremarkable job that involved reviewing claims and filling out paperwork and occasionally meeting with clients who'd had their homes damaged by storms or fires. His neighbors would describe him as quiet, friendly, in a distant sort of way, the type who waved when he saw you but didn't stop to chat. He mowed his lawn every Saturday. He and Carol attended the occasional block party. Their 2 adult children, both in their 30s now, lived out of state and visited on holidays. To anyone looking at Thomas Pearson's life from the outside, there was nothing remarkable about him. Nothing that would suggest he'd been carrying a secret for 40 years that had rotted inside him like a cancer. But Detective Sarah Chen wasn't looking at him from the outside anymore. She was looking at his yearbook photos from 1984, when he'd been 18 and a senior at Berlin High School. She was reading through witness statements where Thomas had described helping organize search parties for Jennifer, posting flyers around town, attending vigils at St. Mary's Lutheran Church where both he and the Hayes family were members. She was studying the timeline and realizing that Thomas had been one of the last people to see Jennifer alive at church youth group on Wednesday evening, just 2 days before she disappeared. He'd driven her home that night because her mother's car was in the shop. He'd been at her memorial service, standing in the back of the church with tears streaming down his face. He'd visited Herman and Patricia Hayes multiple times in the weeks after Jennifer vanished, bringing casseroles, offering to help with anything they needed, the perfect image of a caring young man devastated by the loss of a girl he'd mentored. Chen assembled a surveillance team in mid-July. She needed Thomas Pearson's DNA to confirm what the genealogy suggested, but she needed to obtain it carefully, legally, without alerting him that he was under investigation. The team followed him for a week, documenting his routine. Home to work, work to home, occasional stops at the grocery store or the gym. On July 18th, Thomas stopped at a Dunkin' Donuts on his lunch break, ordered a large coffee and a breakfast sandwich, sat in his car in the parking lot eating while scrolling through his phone. When he finished, he threw the coffee cup and sandwich wrapper in the trash can outside the store. Detective Chen, wearing civilian clothes and a baseball cap, retrieved both items 15 minutes later, handling them with gloved hands, sealing them in evidence bags. The DNA samples were rushed to the state lab with instructions to compare them against the profile from Jennifer's jacket. The lab results came back on July 22nd. Detective Chen was sitting at her desk when the call came, and she listened to the lab technician explain what she already knew in her gut would be true. The DNA from Thomas Pearson's coffee cup matched the DNA from the epithelial cells on Jennifer Hayes' jacket, not a partial match, not a probable match. A definitive match with a probability exceeding 999.9. Thomas Pearson had touched Jennifer's jacket on the night she disappeared. Thomas Pearson, who'd claimed to be at home with his girlfriend that Friday night. Thomas Pearson, who'd helped search for Jennifer while knowing exactly where she was. Thomas Pearson, who'd lived a normal life for 40 years while the Hayes family suffered. The arrest warrant was issued on July 24th. Chen coordinated with the state police and the Hartford County Sheriff's Department, assembling a team of 8 officers for the arrest. They moved at dawn on July 25th, arriving at Thomas Pearson's house at 6 in the morning when the neighborhood was still quiet and the sun was just beginning to lighten the sky. Chen knocked on the door with her hand resting on her service weapon, not sure what to expect. Thomas answered in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his gray hair uncombed, confusion crossing his face when he saw the cluster of police officers on his front porch. Carol appeared behind him in a bathrobe, asking what was happening, her voice rising in pitch. "Thomas Pearson, you're under arrest for the murder of Jennifer Hayes," Chen said, and she watched his face cycle through emotions in rapid succession. Confusion gave way to shock. Shock gave way to something that looked like fear, and then his expression settled into something Chen hadn't expected. Resignation, almost relief. He didn't protest. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply turned around and put his hands behind his back, allowing Chen to handcuff him while Carol screamed questions that no one answered. As they led him to the patrol car, Thomas looked back at his wife once, his eyes filled with something that might have been apology or grief or just exhaustion, and then he climbed into the back seat without resistance. The interrogation room at the Connecticut State Police Barracks in Hartford was sterile and cold, designed to be uncomfortable and intimidating. Thomas sat across from Detective Chen and State Police Detective Marcus Rivera, his handcuffs removed but his wrists marked with red lines where the metal had pressed into his skin. Chen read him his Miranda rights. Thomas waved them, saying he'd talk without a lawyer present, which sent alarm bells ringing in Chen's head because guilty people usually didn't waive their rights unless they wanted to confess. She started with the evidence. The DNA match, the genealogy investigation, the irrefutable science that placed Thomas's skin cells on Jennifer's jacket the night she died. Thomas listened without interrupting, his eyes fixed on the table, and when Chen finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice so soft, they had to lean forward to hear him. "I knew this would happen eventually. I've been waiting for 40 years for someone to figure it out." The confession came slowly, painfully, like pulling teeth, but it came. Thomas talked about being 18 and a senior at Berlin High, about volunteering as a youth group leader at St. Pre-G. Mary's because it looked good on college applications, and because he genuinely liked working with younger kids. About meeting Jennifer Hayes when she joined the youth group as a freshman, about watching her grow from a shy 14-year-old into a confident, beautiful 16-year-old. About the feelings that developed, feelings he knew were wrong, feelings he tried to suppress and ignore and pray away. He'd had a girlfriend his own age, a girl named Susan, who he'd been dating since junior year. He'd been planning to go to UConn in the fall. He'd had a normal teenage life, but he couldn't stop thinking about Jennifer. He never acted on those feelings, he insisted, never touched her inappropriately, never said anything that crossed the line. But he wanted to, God, he'd wanted to. And when Jennifer got serious with Derek Manning, when Thomas realized she'd never see him as anything but her youth group leader, something inside him broke. He'd started following her, he admitted, not every day, just sometimes. He'd drive past her house. He'd park near the high school and watch her at gymnastics practice through the windows. He'd gone to Friendly's a few times when he knew she was working, sitting in a booth and ordering ice cream he didn't want just to be near her. He knew it was obsessive, he knew it was sick, but he couldn't stop himself. Friday, November 9th, Thomas said he'd been driving past Friendly's around 9:30, telling himself he was just going to get ice cream, knowing deep down he was there to see Jennifer. He parked in the back corner of the lot near the dumpsters where it was dark and waited. When Jennifer came out at 9:45, he'd watched her walk to her mother's station wagon. He'd seen her fumbling with her keys, and something in him snapped. He'd gotten out of his van, the dark blue Ford Econoline that matched the description the witness had given 40 years ago. He'd walked up to her. He'd said her name. Jennifer had turned around, surprised but not scared at first because she knew him, trusted him. He told her he needed to talk to her about something important, something about youth group. Jennifer had said she was tired. Could they talk another time? And Thomas had grabbed her arm. Jennifer had pulled away, demanding to know what he was doing, her voice rising. Thomas had panicked, terrified someone would hear, terrified she'd scream. He put his hand over her mouth, trying to quiet her, trying to explain that he just wanted to talk. that he had feelings for her, that he couldn't stop thinking about her. Jennifer had fought back. She'd scratched at his face, his neck, his hands, trying to break free. He grabbed her jacket, pulling her toward his van. She'd broken away for a moment, her keys falling to the ground. But he'd caught her again. And then his hands were around her throat, squeezing, trying to stop her from screaming. And she'd fought so hard, but he was stronger and she couldn't breathe. And then suddenly she went limp in his arms and he realized what he'd done. Thomas's voice broke as he described loading Jennifer's body into his van, driving in a panic to the wooded area off Route 75 that he knew from hiking there as a kid. He buried her there, wrapped in a canvas tarp from his van, dug the hole with a folding shovel, covered it with leaves and branches. He'd driven her car back to Friendly's and left it there, wiping down the steering wheel and door handles, dropping her keys on the ground to make it look like she'd been grabbed before she could get in. He'd gone home, washed the scratches on his face and neck, thrown away the clothes he'd been wearing, and then he'd waited for the police to come. But they never did. Days passed, weeks, months. He'd been questioned once, briefly, as someone who knew Jennifer from church. He'd told them he'd been home with his girlfriend that Friday night. Susan had lied for him, thinking he'd just been out driving around because they'd had a fight earlier that week. The investigation had moved on, and Thomas had gotten away with murder. "Why did you help search for her?" Chen asked, her voice hard. "Why did you go to her memorial service? Why did you visit her parents?" Thomas looked up, his eyes red. "Because I couldn't stay away. Because I needed to know what was happening with the investigation. Because part of me wanted to be caught. And because I genuinely cared about the Hayes family." "I know that sounds insane, but I did. I never wanted to hurt Jennifer. I loved her. What I did to her destroyed me too." Chen felt rage burning in her chest, but kept her voice level. "You didn't love her, Thomas. You obsessed over her. You stalked her. You murdered her. And then you let her family suffer for 40 years while you built a life and had children and went to work every day like you were a normal person. That's not love. That's evil." Thomas didn't argue. He just nodded slowly and asked if he could write a letter to his wife, to his children, to try to explain. Chen told him he could write whatever he wanted from jail. The trial began in November 2024, exactly 40 years after Jennifer Hayes disappeared. The media coverage was intense. The courtroom packed every day with journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and people who remembered Jennifer and had waited decades for this moment. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney Jennifer Morrison, presented the DNA evidence, the genealogy investigation, and the full videotaped confession. They called Detective Chen to walk the jury through the investigation. They called Marcus Chen, the genealogist, to explain the science. They called Dr. Nexus, Rebecca Walsh, to describe the remains and the evidence found with them. They showed the jury photos of Jennifer alive, smiling, 16 years old with her whole life ahead of her. And then they showed what Thomas Pearson had reduced her to. The defense attorney, a public defender named Richard Walsh, who'd drawn an impossible case, tried to argue that the confession had been coerced, that Thomas had been in shock, that the DNA evidence could have innocent explanations. But the jury watched the interrogation video and saw a man confessing in methodical detail, a man who'd been relieved to finally tell the truth. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Thomas Pearson guilty of murder in the first degree, felony murder during the commission of a kidnapping. He showed no emotion when the verdict was read, just stared straight ahead as if he'd expected nothing else. Patricia Hayes was 76 years old when she took the stand to give her victim impact statement. She walked to the witness box slowly, her body bent with age and grief, and faced Thomas Pearson for the first time since learning he'd killed her daughter. She spoke about 40 years of not knowing, 40 years of hoping Jennifer might still be alive somewhere, 40 years of keeping her room unchanged, because letting go of her things felt like letting go of her. She spoke about her husband Robert, who died in 2019 without ever knowing what happened to their daughter, without ever getting justice. She spoke about watching Michael grow up in the shadow of his sister's disappearance, about grandchildren who'd never know their aunt. And then she looked directly at Thomas and said words that echoed through the silent courtroom. "You sat at my kitchen table. You ate meals I cooked for you. You hugged me when I cried, and the whole time you knew. You knew where she was. You knew what you'd done. You looked me in the eyes and lied for 40 years. I don't understand how someone does that. I don't understand how you live with yourself, but I hope every single day for the rest of your life you think about Jennifer. I hope you see her face. I hope you remember what you took from her, from us, from the world. She was going to do beautiful things with her life, and you stole that because you couldn't handle rejection. You're not a man. You're a coward and a monster, and I hope you rot in that prison cell. Michael Hayes spoke next, his voice shaking with anger and grief. He talked about growing up as the brother of the missing girl, about the cloud that hung over his entire childhood and adult life, about finally having answers but hating what those answers revealed. He looked at Thomas and said simply, "You were supposed to be safe. You were supposed to protect her. Instead, you're the reason I never got to see my sister graduate, get married, have kids. You're the reason our family fell apart. I hope you never know a moment of peace." Judge Raymond Martinez sentenced Thomas Pearson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Thomas closed his eyes but said nothing. He was led from the courtroom in chains, Carol Pearson sobbing in the gallery, their adult children sitting beside her in stunned silence, their entire understanding of their father shattered in a single trial. Jennifer Hayes was finally laid to rest in December 2024, 40 years after she disappeared. The funeral was held at St. Ennefind, Mary's Lutheran Church, the same church where she'd attended youth group, where Thomas Pearson had pretended to care about her spiritual development while harboring obsessive thoughts. The service was attended by hundreds of people, former classmates now in their 50s, teachers who'd retired long ago, neighbors who'd never forgotten the girl who vanished. Derek Manning flew in from Arizona, where he lived with his second wife and 3 children. He stood at the back of the church with tears streaming down his face, carrying 40 years of survivor's guilt for being suspected, for not protecting her, for moving on with his life while Jennifer's had been stolen. Patricia Hayes sat in the front pew, her hand resting on the closed casket, finally able to say goodbye properly. The burial was at Cedar Hill Cemetery under a gray December sky that threatened snow. As Jennifer's casket was lowered into the ground, Patricia placed a single item on top of it, a gymnastics ribbon Jennifer had won at a meet the month before she died, faded and fragile after 40 years in Patricia's jewelry box, but still bearing Jennifer's name and permanent marker. Michael stood beside his mother with his arms around her shoulders, both of them crying openly, both of them finally able to mourn without the torture of not knowing. Detective Sarah Chan attended the funeral in her dress uniform, standing at a respectful distance, watching the Hayes family finally find closure. She thought about John Kowalski, the detective who'd carried Jennifer's case for 18 years and died without ever solving it. She thought about how forensic science had reached across 4 decades to catch a killer who thought he was safe. She thought about the other cold cases sitting in evidence rooms across the country, waiting for technology to catch up, waiting for families to finally get answers. Where are you watching this from today? Drop a comment and let us know. Jennifer Hayes' case reminds us that justice doesn't have an expiration date, that evil can hide behind a familiar face, that the people we trust most can harbor the darkest secrets. But it also reminds us that science keeps advancing, that determined investigators never stop fighting for victims, and that truth has a way of surfacing even after 40 years of being buried. Jennifer fought back that night in the Friendly's parking lot. The DNA she collected under her fingernails and on her jacket became the evidence that finally brought her killer to justice. She reached from beyond the grave and pointed investigators toward the truth, one skin cell at a time. Thomas Pearson is serving his life sentence at Northern Correctional Institution in Somers, Connecticut. He'll die in prison, which is exactly what he deserves. Patricia Hayes is still alive at 77, living quietly, visiting Jennifer's grave every Sunday with fresh flowers. Michael Hayes established the Jennifer Hayes Foundation, which provides funding for forensic genealogy investigations in Connecticut cold cases. If Jennifer's case could be solved after 40 years, how many others might be too? The foundation has already helped solve 3 other cases, bringing closure to families who'd waited decades for answers. The case of Jennifer Hayes is closed now, her killer behind bars, her body finally at rest beside her father's grave. But her story lingers as a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like youth group leaders and helpful neighbors and ordinary men living ordinary lives. Sometimes evil wears a friendly face and shakes your hand and sits across from you at dinner. And sometimes, even 40 years later, justice finds a way. The wind moves through Cedar Hill Cemetery, rustling the bare branches of winter trees, and on Jennifer's headstone, placed there by Patricia's trembling hands, are words that say everything that matters. Jennifer Marie Hayes, 1968-1984. Beloved daughter, sister, and friend. Gone but never forgotten. Justice at last.